Hello, Zion. Let's look at the book of Daniel. We're in week number 5 and catching up. Let's go ahead. Remember, chapter 1 used a funny word. When boys would not eat vegetables, it really used the word seeds, which is an odd little word, and that gives us a clue that God is doing a new planting of some kind with these boys. And they ask for just seeds and water. So what do you suppose will grow as God has taken some of the choicest from Israel and cast them out into exile in Babylon? Something's going to grow. Chapter 2 was the dream, Nebuchadnezzar's dream about the statue of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay. Chapter 2 also then begins the Aramaic language section. This is the language of the empire and of the nations. And then also has notes that the kingdom of heaven comes to strike the feet of this statue, and it topples. And so the empires are going to end when the kingdom of heaven comes, which is significant for John the Baptist and Jesus saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then the other thing then in chapter 2 is that kid Daniel, who's just a teenager, late teen probably at this point, is promoted by Nebuchadnezzar, and he's set over the province of Babylon. And this is a long time before Jerusalem is even destroyed. So Daniel is advising Nebuchadnezzar during the last years of the kingdom of Israel. Chapter 3 was the boys in the fiery furnace, a contest about who gets worship. And then last time we looked at chapter 4 about Nebuchadnezzar's humbling and his beast-like transformation, where he's kind of learned 3 lessons here: the food lesson and the worship lesson, and now this humbling lesson. Or the statue lesson. He is pretty well converted by this point. We can call him Saint Nebuchadnezzar if you want to. He writes a chapter of the Bible. Today we look at chapter 5 with the handwriting on the wall. So we look at, we go back to the idea of this timeline here. Chapter 1 was the boys just arrive in Babylon, 605 BC or so. They're sent to school. It's still the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Israel, and it's still in Hebrew. We still are looking at things from Israel's kingdom point of view. But then in chapter 2, we switch to Aramaic, and the Aramaic section goes from chapter 2 all the way down through chapter 7. And so this is kind of an empire viewpoint. We're standing on the empire side of things, looking at things from the empire view. Chapter 8, we'll start to look at history again from standing on Israel's side of history and looking at the nations around, not from the empire viewpoint, but from Israel's viewpoint. But Daniel is in charge now, chapter 2, 3, 4. He has been promoted and he is high in the government. Nebuchadnezzar is still the emperor down through chapter 4, but now in chapter 5 we're going to see that he's gone. And we also have come to the time when the second group of exiles has already come to Babylon. Ezekiel and 10,000 were taken in 598. So that's kind of a stage 2 of the exile, and stage 3 doesn't happen until Jerusalem is destroyed in 587, 586, and that's already happened now too. So these are years ago. By chapter 5, we're all the way down to 539, and this is on the eve of the conquest by the Medes and Persians. The Persian army is outside the gates of Babylon. Cyrus is ready to come in, and this is the last night for Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, after Nebuchadnezzar has been dead for some time. So other things on this timeline, we'll look at it from week to week. We get then to Daniel chapter 5. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought. that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. What is going on? Nebuchadnezzar had been dead and gone for more than a decade. This is 539, and Nebuchadnezzar died in something like 556. So it's been a long 15 years. Daniel's high position of influence and favor would have ended with Nebuchadnezzar, though Daniel was still around, but he just had a small cubicle down at the end of the hall. He did continue in the school of the Chaldeans. Maybe by this time he's mostly retired. By 539, he would have been in his mid 80s. So years have passed, and Daniel is an older man and has not been in favor or power for some time. Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had been succeeded by Nabonidus. Nabonidus was a son-in-law. He married Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And then Nabonidus, though, he moved to Arabia. He's the king of the Babylonian Empire, and for some reason, he wants to rule from Arabia. It's so nice there. He was very unpopular with the people, and he left his son Belshazzar in charge back in Babylon. So Nabonidus is off in Arabia trying to rule his empire from remotely. Belshazzar is the one who's actually on the ground in Babylon. And Belshazzar then appears to have been given some kind of a co-regency. He's reigning along with Belshazzar, or his father. And so he can properly then be called a king. Calling Nebuchadnezzar Belshazzar's father was about office as much as it was about politics. It was as much about office and politics as it was about genealogy. Father is a flexible term, and it sometimes means forefather, like when the Pharisees say, Abraham is our father. So King Belshazzar, it says, then makes a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded the vessels of gold. Okay, what's going on here? This would seem like the height of stupidity to have a drinking party when the Persian army is right outside the city. It's hard to imagine Belshazzar was ignorant of his immediate peril. It's more likely that he invites these 1,000 lords to this feast and brings the holy vessels from every god in all the empire. You know, when they would conquer places, they would loot the temples and bring all the temple treasure from every kingdom that they conquered to the empire's warehouses. And this is to make the people turn towards Babylon instead of turning towards their home god. So because their home god is now over in Babylon, and they'd have to turn that way to look there for hope and help. So they've got all this temple treasure from all these temples, and Jerusalem, one of them. And so they bring all this stuff into this feast, and they all the holy vessels of gold in all the empire's warehouses would have been brought out. And this may have been. It makes more sense to think of this as a desperate appeal. Belshazzar is saying, are any of these gods anywhere able to hear and help? And this, which might be my last night. I don't know what to do about the Persian army outside the gate. So it says Belshazzar made a great feast. That's the English translation in almost every translation. The word here is actually a bread. He makes a great bread. We don't talk like that in English, so feast is an okay translation. But bread and wine here are not incident. It's not a trivial mention of them. The underlying thought here is that bread eating, when you do this religiously, is a memorial. And this was true for Israel. It was true for other ancient nations. You eat bread before your God as a memorial. It's a way of calling on your God to remember and to act. The memorial sacrifices of Leviticus always involved bread. You also have the 12 loaves of face bread in the tabernacle's holy place that's across from the lampstand, and that has this kind of memorial function that's continual. Belshazzar is hoping then that one of these gods is going to somehow see and take pity as he does this memorial feast before them. The point of the feast then seems to have been to appeal to every god in the index, get some kind of help. They praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They drank wine and praised the gods. And don't miss the way that the ancients thought. Drinking wine and eating bread and a memorial meal was a way to get your God to remember his promises and to act. So they make a great bread and they drink wine and praise the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, hoping that one of them will act. And then notice too that gold, silver, bronze, iron, and wood, this is the order of the idolatrous gods here. It's the same order as the statue sections in Nebuchadnezzar's dream back in chapter 2. And that is, I think, is there to kind of trigger our thinking and suggest to us that Belshazzar has been operating with a rival view of history. It's run by these idols that he has assembled before him and not by Daniel's God. He's forgotten what Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had learned, that he is the most high God. But Belshazzar has clearly forgotten that or not acting according to that. So they drink the wine and they praise the God, but then immediately the fingers of a human hand appear and wrote on the plaster wall of the king's palace. Is this one of the gods answering? What's going on here? Opposite the lampstand. We'll talk about that, but think about that. The king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. The king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, and the king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Anybody want that? It's hard to imagine that this was a very attractive incentive because the Persian army, is right outside the gates. So it's like, can you give me some other incentive here? It's like offering a free upgrade to a luxury suite on the Titanic after it's hit the iceberg, or getting a bunker promotion in Berlin in April 1945. You get to be third ruler of the kingdom. Okay, but let's go back to this thing in verse 5. It says, the hand wrote on the plaster wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. It says the lampstand. Now, all the items, it only had mentioned, I'm suggesting that they brought in all the temple treasures from all the kingdoms that they had conquered. But here it does say the lampstand, and it's only really mentioned the treasures of the temple in Jerusalem. So since all the items from Jerusalem's temple were brought, then this mention of the lampstand is significant. The lampstand was a schematic almond tree. You look at an almond, and the almonds have little eye shapes, and they would call almond trees watch trees because you walk by the almond tree and it's full of eyes and it's watching you. So the lampstand, almond tree in the holy place of the tabernacle was across from the 12 loaves of bread. You got the lampstand on this side and the bread on the table over there. So the symbol, the schematic there, the symbolism is God's burning eyes on the light, and the light of his countenance are always watching over Israel. And here that picture is enlarged. God's watching the world empires too. When you bring God's lampstand, it's going to shine and look at you and then write down your judgment. As God watched over the 12 tribes of Israel and their bread, he's also watching over Belshazzar and his bread. And then he's writing because he's been weighed and found wanting. So again, the problem with these world empires is nobody knows what's going on, what's next, why this is happening. It is the God of these Hebrews who is in control, is the lesson of the prophecy. So listen to them. So verse 8, all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. We've seen that phrase before. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So the queen here, it's probably the queen mother here. Back in verse 3, it says his wives and his concubines, they were already at the feast and drinking wine and eating at this great bread. But now the queen comes into the banqueting hall because she has heard. This may be queen mother who is not, wasn't taking part in this feast. This is Belshazzar's mother, perhaps. This would then be the very daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she's then the wife of King Nabonidus. And she remembers everything that happened to Daddy. I mean, she was a little girl, and she always liked that Daniel guy. He was so friendly. And when he came to the palace, and so she comes in, and she has this direct memory and knowledge of the God of heaven who answered Daniel. And let's get Daniel, because your father promoted him. Now, she is here in Babylon, and we know that Nabonidus is not here. He's off in Arabia. And you wonder why, but then it's not too hard to imagine some reasons why Queen Mother would be here in Babylon with her son rather than with her hubby, Nabonidus, off in Arabia. But this makes the most sense to me, is to see this queen being the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And then she's told him about Daniel. We had this guy, and your father, the king, he made this man chief of the magicians and enchanters. And they were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now, the rest of this chapter now is going to use Daniel instead of Belteshazzar. In fact, this is the last time the name Belteshazzar appears, except for the very last great vision in chapters 10, 11, 12. So we've dropped out of Belteshazzar zone, and we're now into Hebrew. We're just using the Hebrew name instead of the empire name. And that's another indication that Daniel had now lost all his empire standing and position. When Nebuchadnezzar died, I think the Belteshazzar name pretty much died with him. Nabonidus wouldn't have cared. Belteshazzar doesn't even know Daniel. It suggests that Daniel had just lost all of his position, and he was regarded merely as one of the exiles of Judah. And they still talk about these people as the exiles of Judah, even though that exile, the last part of the exile, happened 50 years ago. Now we're talking about Daniel. So verse 13, Daniel was brought in before the king. And the king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. I've heard this. Now, the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. They could not show the interpretation of the matter, but I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. There we get that very attractive offer again. So Daniel answers and says before the king, let your gifts be for yourself. Give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. So we're ready. O king, the Most High God. And remember, we talked about how the pagans viewed the panoply of the spread of all the different kinds of gods that they had. And behind them, behind the local gods, this God and that God and this God, there was kind of Most High God and unknown God. And that's the one Daniel keeps bringing to them as the one true living God. Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he killed, whom he would he kept alive, whom he would he raised up, whom he would he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. He was baptized, remember, until he knew that the Most High God rules kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. Now, he was brought down from his kingly throne. His glory was taken from him. We're just, that was chapter 4. Now we're in chapter 5. And all this happened. Don't you remember? Belshazzar, you should remember this happened to Grandpa Nebuchadnezzar. Now, it happened decades ago, but Daniel has to bring it up because clearly Belshazzar is not acting as if he knows and fears God Most High. Belshazzar is ignoring what would have been a well-known lesson that his grandfather learned, and his mother, the queen, remembered Daniel and knew this lesson, but Belshazzar had not. And so that's why the lampstand is shining on the wall and finding that he has been looked at, assessed, and weighed and found wanting. So you, his son Belshazzar, verse 22, you have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Doesn't that remind you of Paul and Areopagus in Acts 17? In him we live and move and have our being. When Paul appeals to the Gentiles, to the idolaters, and to the unbelievers in Athens, to the philosophers, he says, in him we live and move and have our being. The same kind of appeal here to this Belshazzar, the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. There is a sense that the pagans have, that life depends on God. And there's that appeal. Verse 24, then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. God sent this writing. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. And this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, the Chaldeans had been stumped. Nebuchadnezzar's wise men, they're looking at this writing and they can't figure it out, not because it was some kind of, they didn't understand or be able to read the words. These are Aramaic words, would have been written in an Aramaic script. But without a contents, without some kind of context, these words were just a riddle. There may have been some puzzle-like difficulty in the way the letters were arranged. Ancient scripts didn't use spaces, didn't use punctuation. All of the letters were just in a stream together with no spaces. Hebrew and Aramaic had no vowels, so it was just a bunch of consonants across the thing. I remember the first day of my Hebrew class, the professor wrote on the wall, THM and WNTHM, and he said, can anybody read me what that sentence means? What does that sentence mean? THM and WNTHM. What does that mean? Can you figure that out? Any guesses? What would you say? Yeah? Well, you could read it as the man went home. The man went home. THMN went. Okay, yeah, that works. Or, as our professor pointed out, that was everybody's first guess. It could be the men want ham. Okay, does the man go home or do the men want ham? We don't know. And that's one of the challenges with Hebrew, is that the vowels are not inspired. The vowels are later, and the Hebrew text that God inspired just used these consonants and nothing else. So it's an interpretive game that usually there's no question. You can read it and make sense out of it, even without the little vowel helps that were added later. But that's the kind of thing. And so here it is on the wall, in across from the king, across from the lampstand, and they're trying to read it. And so Daniel says it's Mene Tekel Paris, and you have been numbered and weighed, and your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Now, actually, the words here could be reckoned, weighed, and assessed. Maybe those are the words. God has numbered or reckoned the days of your kingdom. You have been weighed in the balances. And then the kingdom really wasn't divided when it was given to the Medes and Persians. It was kind of paid out. And there is some flexibility in that Paris word. It can be something that is paid. And so this Babylon is the reward that God pays to the Medes and Persians for destroying that kingdom. You've been weighed in the balances. Now, there's more difficulty in the puzzle here, because these reckoned, weighed, assessed, these are also the names of weights that are used in scales. A tekel is like a shekel. A mina is 50 shekels. A paris is half a mina. So what do if you say dollar, dime, and penny, what do you suppose that means? That's part of the puzzle that the Chaldeans had. They could look at this thing on the wall and say, dollar, dime, penny. Oh, great king. I don't know. So they have this. That's part of the problem of this puzzle. But Daniel sees it immediately. Mene, your days have been numbered. You've been weighed, and your kingdom is paid out to the others. Now, remember, all this is happening across from the lampstand. And the lampstand is the visible representation of God, who watches and weighs and evaluates and assesses all the times. And then, if you think about it, the lampstand itself visibly remembers scales. You've got the thing going up the middle, and you've got stuff on both sides that kind of balances and reflects this side and that side. So there is this that kind of emblematic and symbolic aspect to the lampstand and being weighed and found wanting. So, verse 29, Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So there you go. Daniel was clothed in purple. Earlier he'd said, "Oh, king, keep it. You don't need to give me anything. I don't want it." He had earlier rejected the offer of the king's reward. He accepts it here, and some suggest, well, maybe Daniel saw a change in Belshazzar. Might have been kind of a foxhole last-minute conversion, or a turning, or some kind of a thing. And he says, okay, if you're going to be that way, I'll take it. So perhaps Belshazzar had truly learned and had truly repented. There is that suggestion in the fact that Daniel receives the clothing and the chain and the proclamation from him. Now, verse 31, in your English Bible, it's verse 31. In the Hebrew text, it's not verse 31. There's only 30 verses in chapter 5, and it's verse 31 is taken as the first verse of chapter 6. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So next week we'll talk about who is this Darius the Mede. He's not known to historians, and this is one of the challenges of those who hold, for those who hold the doctrine of inerrancy. Liberals and skeptical scholars say, aha, see, Darius the Mede. There was no Darius the Mede who ever ruled. We know who the next guy was, and it wasn't Darius the Mede, it was Cyrus the Persian. And so Bible's not true. This was written, hundreds of years later, and the Hebrews who wrote it made a mistake. They just didn't know, and we do. And there are several different kinds of responses to that, obviously, by people who hold the Bible as true. And so the conservatives will say, no, actually, maybe this, maybe that. So stay tuned, because in the lesson next time with Daniel chapter 6, we'll talk about who is Darius the Mede. But we have one more with Daniel appearing as an old man, and he's thrown into the lion's den. See ya next time.